It's not every day you get to introduce the greatest English language playwright since Pinter. I wasn't sure, maybe I shouldn't have said that. I wasn't sure quite what to say, but Tony is a man whose works demand superlatives of us. His great 1994 play, Angels in America, of course, is one of those truly exceptional works, which is perhaps a little bit like the Threepenny Opera, nearly always on somewhere in the world. Some corner of the globe will be playing. In fact, if you have a private jet at your disposal, you're just about in time to set off for the second half at the Thalia Theater in Hamburg. For that play, although you don't really need to know this, Tony, of course, won a Pulitzer Prize, 2 Tony Awards, and then in 2013 he got a, what's it called, a National Arts Medal?
National Arts Medal.
Yeah, from Barack Obama. So he's a man who has been singled out on numerous occasions. His plays are extraordinary in the breadth of their ambition, their intellectual ambition, in formal terms as well, and in their political and moral passion. I wanted to say he's created a whole new theatrical language for a generation, but I think actually there are so few people who can tread in his footsteps and develop what he's done. There are a few people who have either the writerly skills or the chutzpah to bring Angels to America or Home Bodies to Kabul. It is an amazing oeuvre. Anyway, he's also a great Brecht fan. Which is why he's here. He's translated The Good Woman of Sichuan and adapted that and Mother Courage. And Mother Courage was, of course, a triumph on Broadway with Meryl Streep in 2006. So it's a great honor to welcome you, Tony Kushner, to Oxford.
It's wonderful to be here.
We're here to talk about Brecht and the importance of Brecht for your work and in your work. But I can't resist, first of all, asking you what you make of the most recent political developments in this sad country of ours.
What do you mean? I arrived on, I guess it was Thursday night in London at around 8 or 9 o'clock at night and got to my hotel and turned on the news to see if any of the results of the referendum had come in yet, and they hadn't started. I think they started coming in around 10. By 11, my eyes were just, and I fell fast asleep, but right after somebody one of the Tories had just sort of announced that it was going to be a very good day for Remain, and so I fell asleep feeling, good, and then woke up to horror in the morning. It's astonishing. It's really it's a great shock. I've been spending the last hour on my way over here. I almost got run over because I couldn't stop reading it. When Donald Trump arrived in Scotland and announced how happy he was to be in Scotland, which was so excited about leaving the EU. Oceans of vitriolic tweets started appearing from irate Scots people calling him, and now everybody in America has picked up on this and is collecting the sort of horrifying things that Scots people are calling him, like mangled apricot hell beast. That's one of the most polite ones. It's just genius, but it's very frightening. I mean, we were talking about it earlier, and we emailed about it briefly on Friday. That it does feel terrifyingly like the 30s in certain ways. That this kind of right-wing demagoguery attaching itself to a kind of an unformed, inchoate, frantic anger and fear among large populations of lower middle class and working class people, and preying on xenophobia and racism. I guess there's the possibility that this is really going to bring some rather dreadful people to power. There's a real panic in the United States as of yesterday that this might actually mean that Trump, who has been doing a spectacular job in the last few weeks of demolishing his own campaign, could be on the ascendant again. But I don't think that actually it's going to, the problem here will translate. We have problems of our own, God knows, and we're not nearly as good as you guys at calling the people that cause us problems names. But we're...
Yeah, I don't know about that. You're very good at that. If I think of the invective that you wrote for Mother Courage, you had some very choice little epithets there that we could perhaps read.
I don't remember any of it, but sure. I had a long exchange with Frau Brecht-Schall about that. When I first sent my version of it to her, she wrote back and said, it's okay, but why do you have to use the F word? I think she actually called it the F word. And I said, well, I think it's your father's work was not particularly polite, and for modern audience's ears, if it doesn't have that word, it's not going to sound earthy enough. So she let me keep it.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Of Mother Courage in particular, because there's that sort of South German Catholic invective, that sort of Himmel, Herrgott, Sakrament stuff, which you can't translate as Heaven, Lord, God, Sacrament. So you have to do something more contemporary with it. Absolutely. No, I like that. My other sort of question, since I mentioned Angels in America, is about success. Brecht came to be very mistrustful of the success of the Threepenny Opera. He thought if people liked it that much, he must have done something wrong. Do you ever have that feeling about Angels?
No. I call it, my nickname for it is the franchise. And, I'll forgive any critic for trashing anything that I do except Angels in America. My motto is don't fuck with the franchise. Because it's done wonderful things for me. And I don't feel that way. I mean, I have a very, very different relationship, obviously, to my audience than Brecht had with his audiences. And, Brecht, of course, spent an enormous amount of time, 13 years, without an audience, in a sense. During which time, he worked on texts that I think, it seems to me, were intended to achieve a kind of classic stature as opposed to the experimental work that he was doing before he went into exile. So I'm not entirely sure. I mean, he was very nervous about how, by the time Mother Courage was touring England, and he said, they like people to talk faster there, so don't be so slow. We don't want to sound like Germans. We want to sound like we're sort of lighter on the feet.
Absolutely.
He was concerned about its reception and pleased with it. He certainly profited handsomely from Threepenny Opera.
It's true also that he didn't have the opportunity to develop it. He attempted in the Threepenny film, but of course failed to take control of that in the way that he wanted to, whereas you presumably have been able to follow Angels through its various, and even, do you sort of watch its progress through school curricula and things like that?
No. I mean, for a long time, because I was born, and I'm turning 60 this summer, and I was initially somewhat surprised when I learned that it was assigned to undergraduate, because the world has changed a lot, but it's now regularly taught in high schools, and that still seems shocking to me. I mean, I grew up in Louisiana in the 1960s and 1970s, and you wouldn't have had a play that had anal sex on the stage, but kids are different nowadays. So, and I certainly, I had an interesting exchange. Rebecca Miller, who's a friend of mine, asked me to go to the second preview of Ivo van Hove's production of The Crucible that's running on Broadway now. She was in the middle of finishing and bringing out her new film, and I think has a somewhat complicated relationship in her role to her father's work as the sort of curator of Arthur Miller's plays. And she was nervous because there had been a number of cuts made to the text. And we had a long discussion about how much one can or should control, try to control one's work once it goes out there. And there are many, many, many copies of Angels in America out in the world. So I sort of feel like people can do whatever they want. I mean,
You really feel that? Because I imagine that's one of the difficult things. As a writer for the theatre, you always have to let go to some extent, as soon as it goes into its first production.
Yes, I mean, in its first production, to some extent, you have to let it go, or you'll wind up killing it in its cradle. But I don't know. I can't think of anything more horrible than having to worry about, when it was first done in France, there was a French translation sent to me, and my French is a little bit better than my German, which means it's not very good at all. So I tried to sort of see, I could see that it was basically adhering to the subject at hand, and I couldn't really make out much more than that. But of course, it being French, 5 days later, another translation arrived from some very irate person who knew the work of this other translator and knew that he was an idiot and would have completely screwed up. And I was sent these 2 translations, and then there was a great deal of agony about which one was exactly, and around that time, I thought, I'm just going to, kiss it on the forehead, and and that's worked largely. I mean, Ivo van Hove's production of Angels at the Toneel Group in Amsterdam, which was an enormous success, and he cut about 2 hours of text from the play, and I went to see it and loved it, and I could see what he had cut, and I was a little bit shocked by some of it, but it worked, and I think that that's thrilling and exciting. So I'm not. And one of the things that I've learned from Brecht and from Shakespeare is I think it's great that there are variant versions of the ending of Galileo, and the crossing the border scene is and 3 different versions, 4 different versions of Hamlet, 6 different versions. So that it helps make a play more unpredictable if the text is actually going to be a little bit in flux when you.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right, but that is a problem also with Brecht, isn't it? Because he kept control of his versions to a very large extent. They were, yes, there were new ones, but they were authorized by him for new occasions, and he was quite dodgy about translations, although he couldn't really control what happened in translation. And of course, he set up model books, which he always said were not meant to prescribe exactly how the production looked like, but just make it possible to learn from what people had done and make thoughtful progress. But of course, in fact, they were, to some extent, an attempt to keep a hold of the work in the theatre.
Well, as is always true of Brecht, there's that, and then there's the other thing. Yeah. And the other thing is that, starting with, I don't know if it's starting with Edward II, but certainly, throughout his entire career, the ferocity with which he devoured other people's texts and tore texts apart, and when you read accounts of his rehearsal methods and with the Berliner Ensemble, and the sort of assemblage process that, as far as we can tell, attended the writing of the plays, it sort of encourages people to treat the texts with less sacrosanctity than might otherwise be the case. Yeah. And we think of somebody like Heine Müller, who was arguably Brecht's immediate inheritor. Müller's text can't be performed without an immense amount of interpretation, because there's so little information on the page about exactly what's supposed to be happening on stage. You have to. He did that deliberately. So I think it's the effect of Brecht on playwriting has been more in the liberatory than in the sort of proprietary direction.
Yeah, well, that's good. I would certainly hope so. Perhaps we should go back to the beginning, because you've talked elsewhere about your first encounters with Brecht at Columbia University already, and how you developed the ambition to be a playwright a little bit like Brecht, if that was possible. And one of the people who played a big role in those first years was Karl Weber, who was himself, of course, an assistant of Brecht's in the 1950s. Can you tell us a little bit about how that relationship worked and what Karl brought to your understanding of Brecht and the theatre?
Well, I was an undergraduate at Columbia University, and there was no, thank God, no theater major. You had to study liberal arts, not fine arts, which is, I think, a very good thing. And but in a modern drama class in my 3rd year, I think I read Brecht for the first time. It was also the year that Richard Foreman did his Threepenny Opera for Joseph Papp, a production that I still think is one of the 2 or 3 most important productions of my theater-going life. I saw it 8 times, and
Wow.
it really was astonishing. The recording of it isn't it? Well, I mean, I won't say this to you guys; you all know this, but the recording has sometime in the recent past become available again. For a long time, it was blocked, and it's astonishing. It was a great production. And I became obsessed with reading Brecht and trying to understand Brecht. I started reading Marx so that I could understand Brecht, and Brecht made it possible for me to understand.
Which is a nice little parallel, because of course Brecht started reading Marx so that he could understand the world, and
Right.
then you need to read Marx in order to understand Brecht.
Well, I had a degree of sort of American Cold War thinking to overcome when he had his own obstacles, and it took him a while to get to that. I mean, he did write, all those plays before he caught the bug. When I graduated from Columbia, I decided that I would think I had actually decided that I wanted to be a writer, but I was afraid to own that ambition, and instead thought that maybe I should be a director. So I started looking at directing programs, and in an issue of Yale Theater, I saw a picture of Carl working with Ronnie Davis of the San Francisco Mime Troupe. They were starting a thing called Epic Theater West, sort of an attempt to do specifically sort of to study Brecht's method and apply it to theater. And I remember looking at the picture, and Carl had his hair cut like Brecht's. My hair's not usually this short. I'm not trying for that. But he had that sort of, Bonaparte cut or whatever it is, Caesar haircut. And he had worked with Brecht. So I decided I had to go and work with him. So I applied to the directing program at NYU. I was rejected the first time, auditioning with a piece by Brecht.
What was that?
The Beggar and the Dead Dog.
Oh, right, yeah.
It was a terrible I was terrible. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. In the second year, I auditioned with my own piece and got in to the program and studied with Carl for 3 years. And he basically used what I think it's the thing that I think Benjamin describes as the plumpes denken Geschichtslinie, the fat-thinking storyline.
Yep.
It's taken me a very long time. Carl called it the fable,
Yep.
fable, and he used it as a tool for directing, but it was actually a dramaturgical method, and it was an attempt to find a way into the spine of the play that the writer intended, without worrying too much about the writer, but I think that it was always very difficult. We were always enormously frustrated, as one is when one reads, for instance, Brecht's account of Gestus and what is that?
What the hell that means.
It's like, I just read this great essay by Simone Weil, and she said, if you ever want to embarrass a Marxist, ask them to explain what dialectical materialism historical materialism really is, and they'll become incredibly red in the face and flustered, and no one has ever been able to explain it. And she has her point. It's taken me a long time, but to understand the idea of a narrative as being more than simply a series of plot points, but a combination of story and inhalt, depth, ideology, and intellectual intention, and analysis. And that Carl made us literally construct outlines based on that. And there was great frustration in doing that work, but it was also enormously valuable to me in the writer that I eventually became. I still do it. I think a lot of playwrights do, even ones who aren't as enamored of Brecht as I am. But the necessity of an outline, and an outline that isn't just working out the sort of the points of the plot.
Yes, it's sort of Plotter's argument rather than Plotter's sequence of events, perhaps, isn't it? But,
yes.
This is perhaps an entirely stupid question, but how do you do that in your own practice? I mean, what are the mechanics of deciding the progress of a fable? Because I can understand the issue of discovering it in a written work in order to put it on or in order to write about that work, but creating it is a different matter.
That's a good question. I think it's a sort of a combination. It's a kind of a dialectic, and I think it's for me a matter of struggling between the forward momentum of the drama and the entropic pull of depth and complexity, and the necessity of creating a machine that is both lunging forward and also demanding of the audience, or inciting in the audience an appetite for the thing to stop, to be absorbed more fully, which I think happens if the play is in contact with something of real significance below the level of surface plot and psychology, and I think that you find literally as you're writing, and I do 40 versions of the outline, and I try until I sort of know that it's time to start writing the play, and actually I'm finding this true with screenplays, and I had a very interesting conversation with a producer in Hollywood about outlining that screenwriters don't do this, that they're told not to do it, they do treatments instead, which is a way of sort of telling the people who are paying you, because of course it's work for hire, in advance what this thing is going to be, so they'll know whether they want to buy it. But so you're asked to fill out really as if you've seen the movie and you're now describing it, this kind of like 2 or 3 page synopsis of it, which is of course completely impossible to do if you haven't written it yet. And I think it's one of the reasons that so many movies turn out terribly. And the idea that you need to sort of wait until the various levels of drama start to chime together, which I think is part of the process of working on a fable. Yeah. You just find that half the outline will be discussions of ideas, or that you'll derail your own outline by going off and writing a long, 8 or 9 page essay about, whatever particular thing is worrying you, and then you just keep redoing it and redoing it and redoing it, and eventually you start to hear dialogue. I do, and then I know it's probably getting time. It's also a good way to avoid writing, as is reading, and anything that helps you avoid actually making up the names of characters and pretending that you know who these people are and what they're going to say, which is just a miserably difficult moment. It's great.
But what's fascinating about that as a process, and I think probably also very applicable to Brecht as well, is that we tend to think of him, and we tend to think of intellectual playwrights, and I hope you don't mind me describing you like that, as engaged in a very rational project of construction almost. But you're saying that there's a sense in which you have to let go of that in order to feel relationships as you're writing. And that's something I think which is often overlooked when people write about Brecht, simply because they expect him to be expounding an argument, and that's what they're looking for, and they lose all sight of the things that don't fit into that.
And when he began writing the sort of the big Brechts, the ones, the plays by which he's known, there is a sense of a kind of, we were talking just a few minutes ago, you were saying about teaching students the first scene of Caucasian chalk circle. And there's so many scenes that are so sublimely constructed, and entire plays that are, really beautifully, they're all very long, but their construction is remarkable. I mean, the great thing in his diary when he says, I've been sitting here, it's already in the 50s, and he says, I've been sitting here trying to edit A Good Person to Szechuan to make it shorter, but I can't see a way of making it less than 6 hours. So this is another good argument for shortening the working day so that people can spend more time. It's exactly true. And I've seen many, many productions of Szechuan. It's like Hamlet. If you remove the things that it seems easy to remove, it does massive damage to the spectacular beauty of the large argument that the play is making. I mean, the way that the play really dissects the process of commodification and also the mystery of goodness. You can't do anything with it. It's really beautifully constructed. But before he began doing those plays, you have things like the Baden-Baden play for learning are in a way sort of deconstructing themselves at the same time that they're constructing. I mean,
Well, as well as Mother Courage, you've said before that is one of your favourite plays, and I believe 10 years or so ago you were thinking of developing some sort of Lehrstück project of your own. Did anything ever come of that?
Did I say that? I say all sorts of things. I directed it at, I was hired to direct, right after I had graduated, a production with the graduate acting students at NYU, New York University. And I did a sort of mashup of the Baden-Baden play for learning, He Who Says Yes, He Who Says No, and Heiner Müller's Herzstück, which is, of course, a kind of riff on the Mr. Smith clown play. And it was really good. It was a wonderful, I'm very, very proud of that production. And the thrill of working on the text is that the cast has to learn at least some fundamentals of Marxism in order to be able to understand what the hell is going on. And it is a teaching play for the teachers. I mean, it sort of forces you into very painful and complicated encounter with your own assumptions and a necessity of going to sources that can try and explain the origins of this, sort of disturbing form of theater. And it has, like Mueller's plays, there's a section in the Baden-Baden play for learning that's just pages of evidence. That's it. So I sort of took it as freedom to do whatever I wanted there. So we did various things.
And how easy is it to do precisely that sort of work in the States? Brecht in America always seems to be a particularly problematic chapter because he's not taught to actors. And
well, or if he's taught so terribly. I think I had told you this. I went to see to attend a conference on Brecht at the University of North Dakota many years ago in Fargo, North Dakota, and they were doing the students that were doing a production of my version of Good Person of Szechuan, and I said, well, I want to attend the conference because I'm interested in hearing what people have to say about Brecht, but I don't think I really want to see a student production of this very difficult play. And they said, oh, please, see the play. So I saw the play, and it turned out to be great. The kids had done this amazing job. Then I went to the conference, and that was horrendous. Because, no one, again, I mean, the Fremdungs, there was the still persistent notion that what we now call the V effect, which was back then called the A effect, that it had something to do with, I mean, there was an attempt to sort of marry it to Marx's idea from the economic philosophic manuscripts of the workers' alienation, and it doesn't have that meaning at all. So there were a lot of demonstrations of how you work with actors and teach them this effect, by making them do appalling things. Some of it is Brecht's fault because there are. It's the text that he didn't have time and probably never would have standardized his.
He never would have. I think that's the point because there is the Kleines Organen where he does sort of bring it, but that's a retrospective attempt and also he was coming back to Europe and it was a sort of calling card. Look, I have something to say in the theatres. Otherwise, he was always adapting his theory and changing his vocabulary. And the Gestus is, of course, one of the victims of that process because the meaning never really settled down.
It's very, and distanciation as well. There's it's a little bit like, the famous Supreme Court. I can't remember which justice of the U.S. Supreme Court said about pornography. I know it when I see it. I don't know how to define it. so that you think of, there are certain actors that you sort of want to point to and say, okay, this is an actor that Brecht would have loved, or that you know that Brecht loved. Somebody like Lawton or Ethel Merman, who I think was Weigel's. Weigel told Eric Bentley that her first choice for an American actor to play Mother Courage.
Really? I didn't know that, but maybe
she may have been joking, but I don't think so. Actually, it makes complete sense to me, because Merman really, in a certain sense, or somebody like Jack Nicholson. I mean, there are people that seem to do a kind of inside and outside thing at the same time. I'm not sure that that's something that can be. I've yet to hear anyone who's come up with a particularly foolproof way of teaching that to actors. Some actors, I think, are born to do that, and some maybe not.
Yeah, but all of those actors can, at least in some of their great roles, have an ironic relationship with the role.
Yes.
And Lawton, being Henry VIII, is a fantastic example of that. There's no way he's just embodying Henry VIII.
Right. There's not a disappearance, but there are some actors who are really immensely great who do vanish into behavior, and I don't think would ever really be able to play anything that had. And I'm not sure that Lawton knew that he was in any way. It's tricky, and when it's really working, when you're really seeing an actor do it, part of what's disturbing about it, and I think what Brecht intended, is that you're not. If it's too clearly ironic, if there's too much of the actor outside, it doesn't work. It has to be somewhat fugitive and ephemeral. I mean, sort of comes out at moments and then disappears, and then you're back in it. I mean, there's a back and a forth, which is, I think, obviously what he intends. You don't write scene 11 of Mother Courage if you're uninterested in empathy. I don't care, how much of a straw demon he made of Aristotle. It's as we say, a stone would weep. And I've seen people try really hard to ruin that scene. But
it's clear that there's an emotional involvement and an alternation of total emotional engagement, and then the standing next to it, or asking what was all that about.
And when you read accounts of the Berliner Ensemble's production, or watch the film version of it, but you read accounts of it in Berlin and then on the road, no one says, "Oh, this is so great, I was only thinking at the end and not feeling it." Everyone says at the end that I just did a 100th birthday thing for Eric Bentley in New York, so I was back reading all of. He's really an interesting writer. I mean, a great writer about drama as literature, and a really terrible daily critic, but really awful, especially about American playwrights. But astonishing on the subject of, the best, as good as Brecht's writings on Shaw. And I think the best things I've ever read on Shaw. He's telling the story about going to the bar after he gets to the Berliner Ensemble to see the production of Mother Courage, and goes to a bar with Brecht and Weigel, and says, you all know this story, but it says to her, "You seem to age between the lullaby to Katrine when she's dead and starting the next scene. You didn't leave the stage, and you seem to have gotten 15 years older." And she said, "Oh, that was easy," and she took her teeth out. She said, "The only problem is there's no pocket on this." What were we?
While you were talking, it just came into my mind that you've worked with, or at least witnessed, an actor who perhaps is the opposite, and that is Daniel Day-Lewis being your Lincoln. How did that feel? Because he is someone, isn't he, who embodies, and it's hard to see those moments of departure from the role.
I guess. It's interesting.
I think he's great, but
he's very, very great.
Yes, he's fantastic. But I never know quite why I like him so much, because he doesn't seem to do those things that I mostly like in actors.
Although I think he does and he doesn't. I think that actors of great intelligence, and he's enormously intelligent, I think also are people that bring a certain degree of distance. And what he's aiming for, he goes into the character. He told me several weeks before we started filming Lincoln that he was going to stop talking to me after we'd spent a year talking about the film. He said, "Don't take it personally. I'm just not going to be able to talk to you until the film is done." And then he went into the character and was Lincoln, and Spielberg called him Mr. President. And everybody sort of people laugh at that. And then on the other hand, you see this man, pretending to be Abraham Lincoln while this giant camera is pushing into his face, and he maintains his belief in himself as Abraham Lincoln. So you think, well, whatever it takes to do that, it's an absolutely superhuman feat not to be aware of the. He did get very angry at one of the crew members who was walking around with a baseball hat that had a Confederate flag on it. I was with him on that. But I still think there's something a little. It's almost an authorial quality to his characters. Yeah. There's a construction there as well. And I think it's one of the reasons he doesn't do all that many. And I think that's certainly true of Nicholson as well. Vanessa Redgrave, there's a certain sense of both absolute spontaneity and a kind of considered, constructed thing that's both seems at moments to be spontaneous and seems also to be prepared. When he did the very long speech about the Emancipation Proclamation, and he asked Stephen to first let him film the entire thing from start to finish without any cuts, because he wanted to get through the whole thing once, and then he said you can break it up as much as you want to change cameras. And he started out doing the speech, and he was whittling a pencil. And I was sitting on the sideline sort of chewing my fist, and why is he doing that? There's nothing, you just whittle a pencil, just say the word. And then, of course, at the end, I'd forgotten that the last line that I wrote of the speech is, come February, I intend to sign the amendment. And he's sharpened, by the end of the speech, he sharpened a pencil, and there it is. And when he says, sign it, it's in his hand, and he's ready to sign it. It's kind of amazing and brilliant. And there are like 20 moments like that in the film. And, but that's planned, and there's a way that the audience, I think, even experiences it as that. So it's a disappearance and not at the same time.
Before you started working with Spielberg and made those films, Lincoln and Munich in particular, you have said that the only reason to write for cinema was to make a bit of money.
Health insurance and to meet Meryl Streep.
Would you say that still? Or do you think you're able to bring some of the Brechtian of your playwriting into the film writing as well?
Well, I'm not sure that I think Brecht would hate my plays, which makes me very sad. I hope he wouldn't hate the two versions of Courage and Szechuan. But I don't think he would care very much for my work. So I'm not too worried about that. I feel that, I wouldn't write a film that I didn't care about and believe in, not so much because of my sort of sterling moral character, but because I just can't write it. If I don't believe in it, I can't.
I suppose what I'm thinking of is that in both those films, there's a sense of a purposefully mediated narrative. It's not a narrative which you simply enter. In the case of Munich, of course, Asner experiences the events partly through the television, and the film ends with a shot of the Twin Towers. I don't know if that was you or at what point that came into the film. But these things create a narrative frame which give the film a very different meaning from simply a sequence of events or a narrative of events. And I thought of that as perhaps cognate to a fable.
Maybe. I mean, the thing that I've learned about, I've only written those two films. I've written a third film that I'm going to make with Stephen in Italy next year, and I'm working on a fourth film for him, and a couple of other films as well, because it does actually make it possible for me to have health insurance. Playwrights don't own their own copyright. I mean, own their copyright, so we don't have a union, so we can, anyway. You know, I mean, I feel as a screenwriter that I'm, to a degree, subservient to the vision of the director. I love working with Stephen because he actually allows me to collaborate, although it's his decision finally. And I've lost a number of arguments that were very important to me in the process. But I feel that we're closely enough attuned politically that I'm very proud of the two films that we've made. And I'm very excited about the one that's coming up. I mean, one thing that I've learned in working with him, and in a way it is like the very first thing that we take care of. I think playwrights are not necessarily great constructors of plot, of narrative. I think that our real job is the dialectic, is the argument, and finding a way to embody it. If you're a narrative realist playwright, that is. So it's a great joy for me to work with somebody like, I mean, I think that filmmakers and novelists actually have a lot more in common than filmmakers and playwrights. And I think the novel has more in common in terms of its relationship to the audience with film than film has with theater, which I think has a very different relationship to its audience. When Stephen and I work, I write a very, very long draft. The first draft of Lincoln was 500 pages long, and it had to then be reduced to about 160 pages. And there's a great struggle that goes on for the next like 5 or 6 drafts that I now realize is about Stephen trying to identify a narrative spine for himself in the thing, the story that he's going to tell. Because I think it's pretty much inarguable. I mean, you can see people like Hitchcock even recognizing this by the time Spielberg made his first film. He's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, cinematic narrators. I mean, he invented an entire language of telling a story through film. And it's astonishing to watch. I mean, there's a machine in there that's constructed to construct narrative. Once we've found that, he lets me start to stuff back in some of the stuff that I really care about. But in every attempt, there's always one scene that isn't purely about sort of driving the narrative forward that he identifies. He almost always reads it back to me when he gets it, that he really loves. And invariably, that's turned out to be the scene that's kind of the heart of the content of the inner depth of the film, and then I have room to expand. So I guess in a way there is a construction like that.
And that sounds like a very unusual relationship as well, in that we think of writers for film normally very much as writers for hire, whereas there you are.
Usually you don't get to go on the set.
Yeah.
I think I got invited to the set of Munich because it was his idea to make this film that ended with a Mossad agent leaving Israel and moving to the United States. But when he asked me if I would write it, I said, you're going to get into terrible trouble for making this movie. So I think he just wanted me there so that I would be at least as much to blame. But it's been a great deal of fun. I mean, he's an interesting person. He's an immensely successful businessman and producer. But he's a very serious artist, and he takes great risks, and doesn't know, just like England pulling itself out of the UK. It's a leap into the dark. I mean, he's interested in going to places that he hasn't been before and doesn't know.
And we think of those sorts of collaborative relationships perhaps more normally in the theatre rather than in, at least with the writers. rather than in the cinema. Is that an experience that you've had as well? I noticed there are particular directors you've worked with on numerous occasions. Is there an input from there in the writing process as well?
There's a great David Mamet line, film is a collaborative process, bend over. I haven't had that experience, but nor would I necessarily object to it. But theater is absolutely a collective enterprise, and there's no way around it. I mean, the living thing will at some point cease to be what's going on in the rehearsal room, where one has a hope of making one's opinion felt and be on stage without, I mean, there are directors sometimes who stand at the back of the theater and scream at their actors deep into the run of a play, but mostly actors won't put up with that. And the power relation shifts radically, and the act of reading and of interpreting is, you have certain legal rights because it's your script and you rent it to people. You can always refuse to allow them to make the changes that they want to make, but it's essential, and I think essential for the life of the play itself, that you enter into it with the courage to collaborate, which I think does actually require courage. It requires trust in other people that you may not actually really trust, but you need to go forward and give everyone a chance to invest in the material, and that requires, I think, a degree of fortitude and to some extent a retiring of one's ego, and I think that's just axiomatic in working in theater, and I love it. It also makes life as a playwright difficult, because it's very, very hard to leave the rehearsal room, to leave that wonderful, collaborative, exciting place, and then become a writer in private. I can't do what Brecht did. I can't.
Well, I was just going to come on to.
I mean, or at least so far, I haven't been able. I'm trying right now to write. I've been asked to do a short mini-series for HBO. It was my idea for a thing. And because I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now, I'm trying to write with somebody who I've worked with a great deal as a sort of a script editor. But it's very hard. I'm used to being alone, and but it's no fun to be alone. It's very difficult to go off into the, and have no one but yourself and the people that you've made up for company. So that's a struggle, and I think many playwrights. Their work sort of begins to dry up because they have too much trouble. They start to appear in their own plays. That's a sure sign of danger. Or they do what O'Neill did and sort of pronounce anathema on the theater practices of the day, and then more and more refuse to have anything to do with actual living production, which is also a problem. It's striking a balance and maintaining it, I think, is very difficult.
Or they become sort of manically protective, like Beckett did.
Beckett and Beckett's lawyers.
They certainly contributed. But writing it how many seconds long the blackouts should be and things like that.
And if you see the films of the German productions that Beckett directed, you can sort of see that John Lahr says it's the dead weight of authority in the room, that it's not good. I mean, one of the thrilling things about reading about Brecht in rehearsal at the ensemble, or before that. I mean, sometimes it sounds like it must have been just incredibly difficult and, shatteringly chaotic and disturbing. And some of the really early productions, like the Threepenny Opera, it just sounds like, I mean, he's lucky that no one killed him, and it sounds like a lot of people wanted to. But when he had time, and I mean, perhaps too much time, but the amount of conversation in the room and the sort of openness of it is just a really.
It is extraordinary to read about, isn't it? No, it's very difficult to imagine quite how, because the habit was very much to work on his own in the morning, and then to gather people around him in the afternoon, and it's although we have accounts, it's still almost impossible to imagine what the dynamics of those conversations could possibly have been and how you come out with the next stage of the work out of that. And of course, a lot of the relationships were very good and relationships of equals as well as there being some exploitative
Was the
ones
work in the
amongst them.
morning, I mean, because he always had, you know, the sort of the private writing, to some extent the poems, or many of the poems, which weren't, you know, which he felt wouldn't contribute, so he was nervous about publishing them, and the journals and the, so was the morning writing more given to the, because it seems like, at least at first, a lot of the, you hear about, you know, sort of this group of people assembling in his studio to, and it's...
Well, not only, no. I mean, one of the things he did in the morning, yes, was write poems, but he also took the write-ups of the last afternoon and evening's work and went through them again.
Did revisions.
So, so he, and then took them out into the group again in the afternoon. It is an amazing process to imagine.
I mean, and to some extent, by the time he was in charge of the ensemble, the writing begins to, I mean, there are poems still, magnificent poems, but there are no great plays after the years in exile, although it's, you know, it's unfair to judge that. And the man was very young when he died and was living in, you know, very difficult circumstances almost his entire, well, for his entire life, so it's...
Yes, those relationships weren't easy to maintain because of the countries that he moved through and the circumstances in which he worked, absolutely. And yeah, as you say, he died young, so we sometimes think of an old Brecht, but there never was an old Brecht.
It's difficult. One of the things that's complicated about loving him, because you do love a writer whose work you love, you develop a sort of defensive posture towards him, and he's somebody who needs a certain amount of defending. I mean, there's and it's, you know, in the United States, the complicated question of authorship, which was, you know, sort of kicked into a kind of ridiculous high gear by John Fwegge's, I think, unforgivable biography, you know, sort of announcing to the world that he never actually wrote any of these plays, that they were all written by these women that he had imprisoned in the gulag of his affections, and they were all frantically signaling to John Fwegge to come and liberate them, which is, of course, madness.
Complete nonsense,
And it speaks a lot. I mean, that took hold in such a way at a moment when, and in a country where the notion of the individual is sort of also attaining its kind of like, you know, most psychotically hypertrophic development, and the impurity was, you know, I mean, you know, everything had to be the work of one God. So it's complicated. And then on the other hand, there are, you know, things like the story of Elizabeth Hauptmann and knowing exactly, I mean, we treated his collaborators not as well as he possibly should have.
Well, there's a very good film of Elizabeth Hauptmann talking in later life after Brecht's death about what he enabled her to do and how his presence was not so much vampiric as precisely enabling.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, those relationships are complicated.
Yes.
We should open up the questions to the audience as well. I don't know if anybody has questions, but please, go ahead. We haven't got a roving mic, so you just have to shout.
Yeah, that's fine. I was wondering if you had thoughts about that recent controversy with Mother Courage at the classics.
I have many thoughts about it, but I'm also sort of friends with everyone involved. So, I mean, for those of you who don't know, Brian Kulick, who is a really wonderful director, who decided to direct Mother Courage at his theater, the Classic Stage Company. He's now left the company. Tanya Pinkins, an actress that I've worked with, is an African-American actress, was playing Mother Courage. He had set the play in the Congo. Since it's just between friends, I'll say that I told him that I thought it was a terrible idea. I think that Mother Courage is, I've seen it said in the Plains War in the 19th century in America and various other places. I think you can do any number of things sort of design-wise to sort of suggest a relationship between the 17th century and modern times, and the play does that, so much of that for you. But it is not meant to be, I mean, it's a very, very powerful story, and it just doesn't want to be moved, and you immediately run into terrible problems. I mean, just basic. It isn't the Congo. It's not. It's the 100 Years' War is it's a completely different animal, so I had actually told Brian that I thought it was not a good idea, and but he did it anyway. And then the person playing Mother Courage, Tanya Pinkins, quit in great anger and then denounced the whole production. The fight was over this kind of ridiculous thing. Is in scene, I think it's in scene 5, when one of the soldiers who's been looting has a woman's coat on, a fur coat, and Courage says, he can't pay his bar tab, and she says, well, because they haven't been paid. And she says, well, give me that coat. You stole it anyway. And he says, he curses the generals, and then he lets her take the coat. And the young man who was playing the soldier in this production said to the director, why am I letting her take the coat? I'd kill her, because it's the Congo, and it's a very different situation. And this apparently turned into a big discussion that kind of got out of hand, and then Tanya felt that the young man was actually saying, Tanya, if you try to take my coat, I will kill you, Tanya. He wasn't saying that at all. He turned into speaking. I mean, there are a lot. Afterwards, I'll tell you the real dish, because it's kind of interesting. I think it was based on an absolute misunderstanding of the play on Tanya's part, in my opinion. There's a tradition in America that goes all the way back to Jerome Robbins directing it with Anne Bancroft, that what you're watching is the story of a plucky, indomitable lady who won't let the war or the horrible death of her 3 children get her down. And that she's the life force, which of course reduces the play to gibberish. It's like, what is that? It's as stupid as saying that the play is pacifist, which is, when we did it at the National with Deborah Warner's production with Fiona Shaw, some right-wing idiot wrote a thing in the Guardian, maybe not in the Guardian, maybe in the Sun or something, saying, they're doing this Stalinist play, and it was written during the Hitler-Stalin non-aggression pact, and it's designed, and of course the major event in the play is Katrine waking up a village, not so that they can all hold hands and sing, kumbaya. It's to take up arms and defend themselves. It's not a pacifist play in the least. He's not fond of war, but he's not recommending it, but he's, anyway, and I think, so it's just again a failure to grapple with the depths of, what's alive in that play, which is, sort of the most, I think, astonishing dramatic expression ever of the complex relationship between subject and object in terms of history. What is actually meant by historical materialism? What are we made by history, or do we make history? And the answer is yes. And the horror of the play is everywhere. It has many other meanings. When I directed it with undergraduates, the only time I've ever directed a production at the University of New Hampshire in 1980, right when I was starting to work on Angels in America. And there's a nuclear power plant next to the university on this very narrow sort of spit of land that connected one part of the whole coastal region, well, not coastal, but one part of New Hampshire to another. It was like one 2-lane highway that would go past the nuclear power plant. So not a good place to put a nuclear power plant. And this was in the 80s, so it wasn't that far away from 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. There was a lot of anguish and fear in the state. So the power company was running an ad where this man got up and said, and you heard kids playing in the background, and he says, nuclear power is safe, and it hasn't killed anybody, and how do I know? I'm an engineer at the plant, and how safe do I think it is? My children live in a house, 40 feet away from the main reactor, something like that. It's like, well, there's Mother Courage, right? It fits many, many situations, but apart from its connection to a war, the question of how to blame her, in what way do we blame her, in what way do we forgive her? I mean, that's what makes the play so infinite and vast, and I think his greatest play and one of the greatest plays ever written, and that's just not grappled with. So I think that was also part of the fight. I mean, the obvious answer to the question about the soldier is he's stolen this, and he says the general won't allow us to loot because he only allowed us an hour, and that's not enough. So he's got loot. It's obviously he doesn't have a woman's fur coat. He's stolen it from some corpse or something, and he could be shot, so he can't report courage. So there's an answer in the play. And it just turned into a big, ugly, stupid thing. It's a great shame because Tanya, I think, had it in her to be. There was also a problem with the translation.
Let's move on to another question.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry. I mean, it's great to let you talk about Mother Courage, but we had another question in the front row, so I wanted to finish.
You said something about having to understand Marxism to be able to understand Brecht. Do you think it's necessary as well to understand Brecht's understanding of Marxism? Because any academic mainstream understanding of Marxism is not necessarily similar to Brecht's understanding.
Yes, I mean, and absolutely, that's true. I think it really helps to have read Volume 1 of Capital. And especially to read the chapter 10, the working day, and to read the chapter 3 or whatever, the commodity fetishism. I think that those are essential. But if your understanding of Marxism is Marxist-Leninist, there will be points at which you're going to become confused, and that. Brecht's Marxism is a deeply personal and enormously complicated and fluctuating thing. And there are times when he's really sort of trying to turn to the classic texts and present, as in The Mother, a kind of a Marxist-Leninist viewpoint. And then there are times when he sounds like a Trotskyite, and he unquestionably he did admire Trotsky, we know that. And times when he's a Benjaminian, and that's not anybody's idea of, or Benjamin was a Brechtian. I mean, there was, it's hard to say which is which, but they're sort of heretical versions of Marxism. It's a very lively thing. I mean, if you read the Lehrstück, you're also engaging with someone for whom the question of class formation and class identity, as opposed to individual identity, is both. Well, it's a metaphor, but it's also it's essential to grapple with questions of death and dying, and surrender and oblivion and nothing. I mean, some of the profoundest questions that everyone would agree, the profoundest questions of human life. Or if you're doing Mother Courage, you have to engage in Christianity. You can't understand, the play without understanding that Katrina is the person for whom there's no room at the inn. I mean, I think that but I think it's very difficult to understand why these plays look and sound the way they do, and why the traditions, what the traditions are for. And I think I would say that you probably actually can't do Shakespeare without reading Marx as well. I mean, you have to understand that the main function of theater, I think, for Shakespeare as well as for Brecht, is the teaching of critical consciousness. it's not, it's for telling a story, it's for moving people, it's for making people think, but it's also to make people recognize that if you aren't able to look beneath the surface of things and see the artificiality of things, the human construction of things, and the operations of ideology within the sphere of the natural world, of the material world, whatever that is, you will be one of the rude mechanicals. You'll become somebody who on Thursday went and voted to leave the EU and then woke up on Friday and said, oh shit, what have we done? Which is apparently a rather substantial number of people who were saying, I only did it because I was mad. I never thought we'd actually do it. And you don't want to be, you don't want to be bottom. I mean, you might want to be a bottom, but you don't want to be bottom. You want to know the difference between.
We have some loud requests for questions. We were told to keep this to an hour, and we're on 66 minutes. So, Michael, if you promise to be very quick, and if you promise to be very quick as well, and if everyone promises to be very disciplined about leaving the theatre, and I apologise. I will say this, though, Tony will be around at the conference tomorrow, so you will have an opportunity to talk to him, I hope very much, Michael.
Yeah, you were fascinating talking about the relationship and the collaboration with Spielberg. Can you say something about working with Mike Nichols on Angels in America? Particularly seeing in the documentary, the interviews that was made just before he died, he said that his approach to dramaturgy was there were three factors and to a scene. One was negotiation, seduction, and something else.
I mean, I adored Mike. He was really one of the most astonishing people. Well, he really was like one of the most astonishing people ever. I had never been on a film set or written a screenplay when I said to him that I would let him do the film version of Angels, and he taught me the most important lesson I've had about screenwriting. I wrote, all this nonsense like point of view, and the camera does this and the camera does that, and he read the first thing. He was he had sort of a Versailles level of politeness and manners, and he said, so have you ever actually made a film? And I said, no. And he said, have you ever been on a film set? And I said, no. And he said, well, I can see that. And he said, I have, and all you have to tell me is what the people are going to say, and I'll take care of the rest. And it was like this great liberation, because I didn't have to lie, and I could just do that. He was very different than Stephen. I mean, Mike is a European. Mike's grandfather was, one of in the Munich Soviet. I mean, was an important German anarchist thinker, and his grandmother translated Salome for Richard Strauss. So that's. And I think that there's a kind of classicism, I mean, a sort of restraint. It's in his work and a coolness and in the way that he directed too. So it was a fascinating thing to be. Those are the two film directors that I've worked with so far as Mike Nichols. I've been a very, very lucky guy. So
we have to stop there. I'm sorry. I have a little token of appreciation from the Brecht Society. Let me
books.
give you that. Join me in thanking